So, welcome to this introductory lecture to accompany your course on political ideologies. As you know, I've put these lectures together because I believe that to really get your head around these ideas properly requires an understanding of the historical context in which these ideas were produced or came to prominence. In fact, personally, more than that, I believe that the dominant ideas in society often tend to reflect the social interests or even class interests of those who produce them or promote them. And by me telling you this, I'm also giving you an idea of where I'm coming from, politically or ideologically, which is important for you to know, because I told you before that we need to be able to critique the course itself. That includes the specification, what's included, what's excluded, the textbook, you know, how certain figures are portrayed or not portrayed. But it also includes me. You need to critique me as well, where I'm coming from. So as the course progresses, hopefully you'll get more of an idea of where I'm coming from, because no one is neutral. That's what I believe. Everyone's views are shaped by their experiences, their position in society, their position in the global hierarchy, the class, gender and racial hierarchies that exist. So those are just a few things to bear in mind, or maybe to come back to later. But for now, without further ado, let's go into this first historical episode that I want to cover, which is the Crisis of Feudalism, which really starts to seriously bite in the 14th century, the 1300s. So first of all, what is feudalism? To cut a long story short, it's a system based on the idea of mutual obligations. So in your notes, make sure you have that phrase down, mutual obligations, between the different classes in society. Now, I'm going to oversimplify here, but basically within feudalism, you had two main classes. You had the aristocracy, who were the landowning class, and the peasants, most of whom were serfs, which basically means unfree peasants, serfs, who did the bulk of the work, which at that point consisted mainly of growing food. Now, this is an oversimplification to say there were basically two classes, because there were, of course, other classes of people around at the time as well. There would have been craftsmen, artisans, there were merchants, traders, there was the clergy, the monks and nuns and so on. But most people were peasants, growing food, and had these ties of mutual obligation to their lord. So you can think of feudalism as a pyramid in which you have at the very top, well, who do you have at the very top? Pause the video here and tell me. The monarch, right? Usually a king. So first of all, let's consider the mutual obligations between the king on the one hand and the lords, also known as the barons, also known as the aristocracy, on the other. So what do you think each of these two institutions provided for each other? First of all, what do you think the king provided to the lords? What were his obligations to them? So pause the video here and see what you can come up with. Did you do it? Come on, you need to do it. Don't just ignore my instructions. This is supposed to be an interactive video. Anyway, what did the king provide to the lords? Pause the video and think about it. Did you do it this time? Yeah, sure you did. Well, anyway, what the king provided to the lords was land, first of all. Right? Remember, the aristocracy are the landowners. Because basically, actually, the king owned all the land in, for example, England, if we focus on England for now, where in England the feudal system had been basically established by William the Conqueror after the Norman conquest of 1066. So he owned all the land in England, but he would give portions of land, portion of the country to the lands, to the lords or the barons, and he would provide also, this is the second thing, security. In other words, he would guarantee that their land and their wealth was safe from bandits or from incursions from other lords or from other countries. Now, so that's what the king provided to the barons: land, first of all, and security. Now, what then did the lords provide the king in return? So pause the video and think. Did you do it? You're only cheating yourself, you know. Anyway, so the lords provided the king with their allegiance, their loyalty. They would support his claim to the throne, they would obey his laws, but also on a more concrete level, they would provide him with taxes and, when necessary, soldiers to fight wars. Okay, now who's at the bottom of the pyramid? Pause the video and tell me. That's right, the peasants, and especially the serfs. So what were the ties of obligation between the lords and the peasants on the bottom of the pyramid there? So first of all, what did the lords provide for the peasants? Pause the video. Really is the same thing. First of all, land. Peasants would be allowed a small plot of land on which they could have a house and on which they could grow food to feed their family. And secondly, again, security. The lord would be supposed to, again, ensure the peasants were protected from attack by bandits and other lords, other peasants, and so on. So what did the peasants have to provide the lords in return? Pause the video here. Again, the same really, taxes. And these would often take the form not of money necessarily, but what's known as taxes in kind, which was often in the form of a percentage or proportion of the peasant's crop, as well as labour services, the corvée as it was known. Certain things the peasants on each estate would have to do for that landlord. Often included a certain number of days per year where they were basically doing forced labour for the lord, and they might be called on to join the army in times of war as well. So, in a very, very oversimplified way, that is basically the feudal system. There's just one more thing I'd add at this point, which is that the serfs, who remember formed the bulk of the peasantry, of the peasant class, were bound to the land. In fact, jot that phrase down as well, bound to the land. The serfs were bound to the land. And then pause the video and consider what that phrase might mean. Okay? So, basically it means that they were not allowed to leave the estate, the manor on which they were born. It was almost as if they were considered part of the land. So when the king parcelled out the big landed estates to his cronies, he was also parcelling out the people that lived on them. And those people were not allowed to simply up sticks and move elsewhere unless they had specific permission to do so, or unless they had what's called a certificate of manumission, which basically freed them from serfdom and turned them into what's called a free man. And it goes without saying that it was a pretty tough life for a serf. Not only were their freedoms severely limited or even non-existent, they couldn't choose what kind of work to do, they had to work for the lord of the estate in which they were born, they had no freedom of movement to move around the country, they even needed their lord's permission to marry. And in some places, so it said, the custom was the lord could demand the right even to sleep with the bride on the eve of her wedding day. But not only were freedoms greatly limited, also the work was very tough. Farming's a tough life today, even with all the modern technology and so on. Back then, would have been absolutely backbreaking work. Any funny weather and you're at risk of starvation, tough. Okay, so that's the feudal system. Monarch at the top, barons, lords, in the middle, peasants at the bottom. Hopefully you have at least a rough idea of this very hierarchical structure of society in which the bulk of the population were serfs, living very hard lives, which were more or less completely under the control of the lord, to whom they had to perform all kinds of forced labour and frequently hand over great chunks of their crop. Okay, so that's feudalism. And it was already facing some problems by the 14th century, but really the beginning of the end came with the Black Death, which struck in 1347 and which wiped out about a third of the population of Europe. Now, although it was a terrible event for all classes of people, including the peasants, it did actually have the effect of greatly increasing the power of the peasants, the class power of the peasants, and then particularly the value of their labour. Now pause the video here and consider, why did it have that effect? Okay, did you do it? Don't try and fob me off. I can just tell. I haven't even finished making the video yet, but I can still tell you're not doing it, are you? Anyway, if you are, well done. Good for you. Did you get it? The way I think of it is this. Think about basic economics, the laws of supply and demand. If the supply of a commodity is reduced, what happens to the price? It goes up, right? Because it's more scarce, there's not enough of it to go around, so whoever's selling the thing can start selling off to the highest bidder. They can push their prices up. And so what the Black Death did is it reduced the supply of labour power, of labourers, of workers, of peasants. So the holders of labour power, the peasants who are doing the work, could start putting their price up because it was more valuable, it was more valued, everyone needed it, they were desperate for it. The peasants could start basically demanding more for their labour. Because all the estates had lost a third of their labour force on average, so they were all desperate for labour. So labourers could start saying, well, okay, I'll come and work for you, but I'm not going to do the corvée, I'm not going to do any forced labour. I'll give you a proportion of my crop, but that's it. Oh, and I want double the land I had before. And I want you to pay me in money for any work I do on your estate as well. Because under feudalism, it wasn't particularly a money-based economy. As we've seen, the exchanges taking place were mainly based around land and taxes in kind, proportion of crops being handed over. But now the peasants started demanding actual cash wages for any work they did on the lord's estate. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hang on a minute. How could the peasants say to anybody, "I'll come and work for you," when they were bound to the land, when they had no freedom of movement, when they had by law only to work for the lord of the manor which they were born into? It's a good question, and the answer is basically that the whole system had started to break down. And it had started to break down again because each lord was so desperate for labour that they were not going to send peasants offering to work for them back to their old estate, right? Because they needed them. So the lords basically encouraged the breakdown of the system themselves. They basically stopped enforcing these laws. Each lord wanted the laws enforced for his own serfs. He didn't want them to be allowed to leave, but he was unwilling to enforce them when it came to others. He wasn't going to send someone else's serfs back to them because he wanted them. So this feudal system started to break down. And we can see this in the laws that were passed in the decades following the Black Death, which were known as the Labour Ordinances, which massively increased the penalties for serfs leaving their estates. And they kept passing more and more of these laws with stricter and stricter penalties each time. Now, what does that tell you? If they keep having to pass the same law again and again with stricter penalties each time, it basically tells you that the last lot of penalties were not working, that the law is not being enforced, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have to keep passing it again and again. It's like, think about on Show My Homework, the past 5 weeks, it's always said, make sure you finish your independent research project, right? So what does that tell you? It tells you there's a bunch of people that haven't done it. If you'd all done it weeks ago when I'd asked you to, I wouldn't need to keep saying each week, again and again, make sure you finish it this time. And it's the same with these laws. If everyone was complying with them, they wouldn't need to keep passing the same laws again and again with harsher penalties. So we know the system was falling apart, and this meant that there was a massive shift in class power away from the aristocracy and in favour of the peasantry. So if you look at the 15th century, the century that followed the Black Death, it was probably the century in history that the common man and women were better off than they'd ever been before, or perhaps it would even be again afterwards, in terms of their share of the wealth that was being produced. A.L. Morton, author of The People's History of England, says, quote, "The 15th century was probably the period of the greatest prosperity for the labouring population of rural England." So that's nice for them, but the landlords, the aristocracy, were in total despair, as they were seeing more and more of the wealth they believed they were entitled to going to the workers who produced it, the peasants. So the question is, what did the landlord class, the aristocracy, and the government, what did they do in response to this kind of unprecedented situation where the peasants seemed to be the ones with the power? Well, they basically tried to turn the clock back. As we've seen, the government passed a number of new laws, the Labour Ordinances, to try to prevent peasants leaving their estates, even trying to impose maximum wages. Like we now have a minimum wage, these laws tried to impose a maximum wage, so peasants couldn't be paid more than whatever it was. But as we've seen, those laws didn't really work. So secondly, they went to war. The king went to war. The king felt he needed to capture more land and more labourers to make up for the labourers that had been lost in the Black Death. But the problem was that these wars didn't go well. And of course they cost money, which meant he had to squeeze more taxes out of the people, which made him very unpopular, and actually caused one of the biggest rebellions, probably the biggest rebellion in English history, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. One other thing that happened was that the church began to crack down on the practices of contraception and abortion that they'd previously more or less tolerated, in an attempt to ensure basically that the wombs of peasant women did their bit to restore the supply of labourers. In fact, one historian, Silvia Federici, argues that this attempt to crack down on the medicine women providing these services of contraception, abortion and so on was one of the causes of the witch hunts that swept Europe in the centuries that followed. So neither law nor war, it seemed, was enough to restore the landlords to their former position. So what then began to happen was that a new system, what Marxists would call a new system of exploitation, began to emerge out of the ruins of feudalism, a system that eventually came to be known as capitalism. And there are a number of ways in which this came about. One thing that happened was that the aristocracy began increasingly to turn to trade, in particular the wool trade. Unable to maintain their wealthy position through feudal agriculture, many of them began to realize that they were able to do so more easily through turning to sheep farming. Wool was quite a profitable commodity at that time, and of course it does not need so many labourers, so it seemed to make a lot of sense. So much so, in fact, that from going a situation where they were desperate for labourers in the late 14th century, by the early 16th century, landlords were increasingly throwing peasants off their lands, getting rid of the ones they did have in order to make way for sheep. It was this phenomenon of peasants being dispossessed of their land by lords seeking profit from wool that led Thomas More, who later became Lord Chancellor to Henry VIII, to suggest that England had become a country in which sheep eat people. In his 1516 book Utopia, he said to these lords, quote, "Your sheep that were wont to be so meek and tame and so small eaters, now, as I heard say, become so great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. They consume, destroy and devour whole fields, houses and cities," he said. Of course, they didn't literally do that, but the lust for wool profits meant that peasant lives and villages and livelihoods were now being destroyed to make way for sheep. And this process created two new classes. Capitalist farmers, that is farmers involved in commodity production, that is producing things to be sold, to be traded on the market, on the one hand, and on the other hand the proletariat, the dispossessed peasants who now had no access to the means of subsistence, that is to say no way of surviving, no land on which to grow food. And so what was happening to the aristocracy was that they were either embracing this new type of capitalist farming or they were going bankrupt, forced to sell their land to those who had become successful capitalist landlords. And at the same time, the race was on to find new sources of wealth, new labourers and new markets to sell to abroad. So we can also see that the impetus for both the slave trade and colonialism also came in part from the collapse of feudalism spurred by the Black Death as well. So in summary, one of the main consequences of the Black Death of the 14th century was a huge shift in power and wealth from the landlords, from the barons, to the peasantry. And this led initially to several unsuccessful attempts to put the clock back and reassert baronial dominance through new laws and attempts at conquest by war. But over a long time period, it led to a turn by the elite classes towards trade, which meant on the one hand a turn in agriculture, away from a subsistence-based feudal economy and towards a more trade-based commercial economy based initially on the wool trade. And on the other hand, it meant a turn ultimately towards seeking wealth and power abroad in the form of colonialism and the slave trade, on which we'll pick up more in the next lecture. Okay, thank you for listening. Now, how do I turn this off?